In 1666, London was hit by one of the worst fires that the city had ever known. But who or what started the fire? How could it have been prevented? And just what does the fire have to do with an unassuming bakery? Come with me as we delve into The Day London Burned. By the 1660s, London was by far the largest city in Britain, and the third largest city in the entire Western world, only beaten by Paris and Constantinople. Originally a Roman outpost, the Roman walls designated where the city proper ended, and it is inside these Roman walls where the densest population resided. The city proper covered only 700 acres, or about 1 square mile, but had some 80,000 people living within the Roman walls. At the time, the city proper still followed a medieval street plan, with narrow cobblestone streets. And to make matters worse, to make the maximum use of the limited land within the walls, people built their houses with jetties or overhanging second floors. These jetties were known to spread fires. As recently as 1633, just some 30 years prior, another fire tore through London, and eventually led King Charles II in 1661 to issue a proclamation banning jetties or overhanging windows. But this was largely ignored by local governments. This then prompted the king in 1665 to increase the width of the streets, but this too was largely ignored as well. London in the 1660s was overcrowded to say the least, and to make matters worse, the Roman wall separating the city proper from the newer parts of Greater London only had 8 narrow exits that even on normal days would become clogged with traffic. When the fire first began, few people had the idea to leave the city. They would simply grab what they could and move to a safer area, sometimes moving as many as 4 or 5 times a day. As the fire spread, there was a mad dash to the wall, which, as mentioned previously, even on normal days would become clogged, and now was absolutely overrun. Another factor for the fire's devastation was that the English Civil War, which was fought between 1642 and 1651, had recently ended, and London had a surplus of gunpowder. Veterans of the war had come back and brought with them barrels of black powder to keep in their homes, especially near the docks of the River Thames. The Tower of London alone held 500 to 600 tons of black powder. One of the biggest contributions to the devastation of the fire was the Great Plague of 1665, that killed 100,000 people, almost a quarter of London's population, in 18 months. The Great Plague of 1665 rivaled the more famous Black Death that occurred some 300 years previously in the middle of the 14th century. I have a video going more into depth on that topic in the description if you want to know more about that. Just after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, Thomas Farriner woke up to find smoke filling his bedroom on the second floor of his bakery on Pudding Lane. The family was trapped, but managed to escape to the house next door from an upstairs window, except for a maid who was too frightened to jump to the next house and thus became the first casualty of the fire. After an hour, the constables arrived and judged that the neighboring houses be demolished, as it was the only way to ensure that the fire didn't spread. The people who owned the adjacent houses protested, and the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was summoned to give his approval. When the Lord Mayor arrived, he declined to have the buildings demolished on the grounds that the owners could not be found. After the fire, many people said that if Bloodworth had demolished the adjacent buildings, the fire could have been more easily contained and the fire would have been much less deadly, but this has never been confirmed. Samuel Pepys, known for writing one of the first few hand accounts of the fire, ascended the Tower of London on Sunday morning and noted that thanks to the strong eastern winds that morning, the fire had already burned 300 houses, and said, "It made me weep to see it." By Sunday afternoon, the fire had turned into a firestorm, generating its own weather, and by Sunday evening it had become the most damaging fire to strike London in living memory, and had traveled 500 meters, or 1,600 feet, along the River Thames. The next day, on the 3rd, the fire spread west and north, across to the wealthier side of London. It was on the second day that people began to realize the full extent of the devastation occurring. The fire spread so quickly that even the Royal Exchange, where the majority of London's gold was stored, was completely burned by late afternoon. John Evelyn, another diarist and first-hand account, wrote, "The conflagration was so universal, and people were so astonished, that from the beginning, I know not by what despondency or fate, they had hardly stirred to quench it,
so that there was nothing heard or seen but crying out and lamentation, running about like distracted creatures without at all attempting to save even their own goods. Such a strange consternation there was upon them. It was also on this day that a more organized and coordinated effort began. Lord Mayor Bloodworth, who was slow in taking action against the fire, finally called for buildings to be demolished and for emergency firemen to be called, but at this point, half of London had burned or was still on fire. Things went from bad to worse on Tuesday the 4th, as the winds, which were already strong on the previous 2 days, had picked up even more. On this day, the fire traveled westward all the way to Fleet Street and beyond the Roman walls to the newer parts of London. All the while, as the fire was raging, most people clamored for safety in St. Paul's Cathedral, as it was deemed the safest place thanks to its thick stone walls and wide empty plaza, creating a natural fire break. Unfortunately, at the time, the cathedral was undergoing renovations and had wooden scaffolding surrounding the majority of it. The scaffolding caught fire in the evening, and within half an hour the lead roof was melting and the books, papers, and codices were burning. Finally, by Wednesday the 5th, the fire was able to be contained to some extent. Samuel Pepys wrote again about the destruction and said, "It was the saddest sight I have ever seen." Although the fire was somewhat under control by the 5th, and is deemed to be the end of the Great Fire, there were still isolated fires that burned for up to 2 months after the fact. When the fire was mostly contained, estimates on the damage ranged from about 9 to 10 million pounds, or over 2 billion pounds today. In the days and weeks that followed, people were quick to blame foreigners and immigrants on the fire, particularly the Catholics and the French and the Dutch, which England was at war with at the time. By 1671, 5 years after the fire, most houses were rebuilt, 51 new churches were built, and St. Paul's Cathedral was being rebuilt as well, but would not be reopened until 1697. In modern times, many historians have said that the Great Fire of London in 1666 was the worst thing to happen to London until the Blitz during World War II, and it all started on that September night in that unassuming bakery, the day London burned.